Hey, how's it going?
This is Ellen. She's engaged to one of my closest college friends and also happens to work with companies to help them get through the FDA clinical trial process. I got to ask her questions like, when will Neuralink finish human trials? Who selects trial participants? And are there ways to expedite the approval timeline?
My name's Ellen Maui. I am a clinical research associate, and I have a background in biomedical engineering, neurology, and research broadly. And my primary objective is to ensure that if an FDA inspector were to come on site, there would be no findings that would jeopardize conduct of the trial and subsequently approval of the therapy. I work in clinical operations, which is kind of the active conduct of clinical trials at the site level.
When Elon says that Neuralink has submitted their FDA application, do you think that's the IDE?
I do think it's the IDE. However, the FDA's timeline to return comments on an IDE is 30 days, unless they have questions or concerns or issues with the IDE. So if an IDE has been submitted, it's likely in ongoing negotiations. The way an IDE works, you submit it and the FDA has 30 days to respond to you. Um, you know, they can either respond with an affirmative, not respond within 30 days, which is considered an affirmative, or they respond with questions, concerns, requests.
Interesting. So no response is considered like go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. And then there's nothing that's going to be shown publicly until quite a bit later, right? Like there's no way to go research if what Neuralink's status is.
No, I mean, you can submit a FOIA, but that's it's always kind of a it's not for sure if you're going to get the information that you request with a FOIA. Like you can like submit a request for an IDE application, but that's typically not going to be information that's public. I think the first public FDA or like regulated information that would come out would be a clinical trial listing whenever that's announced. And clinical trial listings can be posted on clinicaltrials.gov even before they're recruiting. So you can see, if a study is, listed but not recruiting, currently recruiting, invitation only, if they're closed to recruitment, or what have you. But I think that would be the first like regulated information that will be available upon acceptance of the IDE.
I see. Did you see that Neuralink or Elon announced on Twitter that Neuralink is going to do like an update presentation on Halloween this year?
Yeah, I thought that was a like the branding of Halloween is an interesting time to do that. I mean, I'm hopeful that it'll be announcement of their IDE acceptance and initiation or announcement of their trials. But who really knows? Like in interactions with the FDA, it can take months, years. It's very inconsistent and unpredictable how long the negotiations and meetings are going to take.
I see. So what do you think are some of the possible holdups?
Well, I think like with the level of interaction that you get with the FDA through a breakthrough designation, although like it is beneficial to have that level of access, the FDA has a lot of time to respond to you. So, for example, those sprint meetings, they're called sprint meetings, but they have 45 days to respond to your requests or address an individual issue. With even like pre-IDE meetings, the time frame from like submission or request for a pre-submission meeting to the actual meeting could be anywhere from 75 to 90 days. Like I mentioned, like the FDA has 30 days to respond to your IDE. Like every time you interact with the FDA, like a new clock starts. So it's a very slow process, just to interact and, get answers. However, I think the more time and the more careful that an organization is with their protocol development, statistical analysis plan, data acquisition plan, the better. Like you really want to have a well-designed protocol that the FDA will be, more willing to accept, because it's, the end goal is that pre-market application, like it's your goal is the market. And although, getting into human clinical trials is a milestone, I think the more careful you are with your protocol development, the better outcome you'll have in the long run. Like you can shave, 5 years off your development process by taking an extra year or year and a half in your pre-IDE negotiations and conversations. I don't think I've seen any literature published on the preclinical animal studies. The FDA may be asking for additional preclinical in vivo studies. It is really hard to say what the delay is, but it's most likely FDA driven.
Typical timeline for trials, like if you could just, like, the entire thing.
Yeah, so once you get in humans, so that initial feasibility study, if you look at BrainGate, Synchron, like the Medtronic neurostimulator device, you're looking at a year for the actual trial timeline. That doesn't include, the time that it will take to recruit patients or analyze the data. So for your initial feasibility studies, you're probably looking at like 2-3 years. I'd say 2-3 conservatively. And then after your initial feasibility studies, you need to do the pivotal studies. So there may be a number of pivotal studies that you need to conduct to display efficacy. Those will probably be, again, like approximately 1 year in duration. And with the increased enrollment numbers, I'd say probably 3 years for completion of a pivotal study in the data analysis. So probably looking at, I'd say, 6-7 years to market, and that's being pretty optimistic.
And their initial application is to help people with paralysis be able to regain control of like a computer keyboard and mouse.
Mm-hmm.
Or just like regain some kind of limited functionality relative to their longer term aspirations. But their goal is to help with a wide variety of neurological issues. And so if there's approval for Neuralink to do this helping paralyzed patients, does that mean that they can also use the same tech and not have to go through another process of getting approval for helping other types of illnesses?
So with devices, I'm not 100% sure of how off-label use for devices works and in marketing of such, but I know with drug trials, if you want to market for a specific indication, you need to conduct a clinical trial for that specific indication. And trials can run in parallel for multiple indications, or you could have a protocol in which like multiple indications are targeted. However, just for streamlining the regulatory process. Typically more focused therapies or indications are, advised. Like you don't want to cast too wide of a net because it's difficult to show efficacy.
Okay, I see. And who selects trial participants?
So trial participants are, it's described in the protocol. So you have your inclusion and exclusion criteria for what sort of patients that you'd like to enroll and must enroll in the protocol. And just depending on the therapeutic device or sponsor, the inclusion exclusion criteria could be extremely broad or fairly strict. I know the FDA has a guidance document that was released in May 2021 on brain-computer interfaces that specifies their recommended inclusion exclusion criteria for subjects. But ultimately, when you have a clinical trial ongoing, it's really the responsibility of the investigator at the clinical trial site to make the call on who they're enrolling in the study. It's a pretty big deal if a subject who is not eligible is enrolled, and it may affect the statistical analysis in a negative way. So it's really important to have a well-designed inclusion and exclusion criteria.
I see. And so you mentioned an investigator. Does that mean like the primary point of contact at the company or organization that's
So the principal investigator is going to be the person at the hospital who is enrolling the patients. And the way a drug or device trial works is you have your sponsor. So in this case, the sponsor would be Neuralink. However, the investigation is going to be run at most likely clinical trial sites, which are academic medical centers. So they'll be working with key opinion leaders, physicians who kind of have some weight behind them. And the physicians assume responsibility for the conduct of the trial. Of course, the sponsor is responsible. The sponsor is responsible for reporting to the FDA. However, the investigator at the site is the person who is responsible for the conduct of the research, reporting adverse events to the sponsor, and ensuring that the study is being conducted according to protocol. So really the principal investigator becomes, the person who is primarily responsible for the research once it's approved by the IRB. And, they oversee the patients, because you don't want to have the kind of undue influence of the sponsor. There's usually a pretty clear division between the investigative site, like the principal investigator and his team, and the sponsor.
Is there an FDA in other countries, FDA equivalent in other countries?
Yeah. So every country has their own governing body for clinical trials. I'm not an expert in international clinical trials, but for example, there is the EMA. It's probably the largest governing body for drug and device regulations outside of the FDA. And the EMA, they govern, European drug and device approvals. I'd say the one thing that they have pretty similar regulations. They do have some difference in the classification of devices. Like, for example, instead of having class 2 devices, they have class 2A and 2B, which may affect the way that BCIs are marketed in Europe. But in addition to the FDA and the EMA, you also have like the UK's MHRA, Canada has their own regulatory board. I mean, every country regulates drugs and devices, and in some countries it may be advantageous from a timeline perspective to run trials there, but ultimately you see most sponsors going to the US and the EU for drug development, because typically, an approval from the EMA or FDA will give you a lot more leeway when you're looking to expand internationally. Like it's a pretty strong stamp of approval.
Gotcha. So there's a couple of, or a few audience questions, and I'm just going to read them verbatim so that I don't misrepresent what they're wanting to have answered. Can you get a general license to do human trials where you can explore different use cases and try something that wasn't originally planned, or do you have to spell out the use cases in advance?
So typically, your clinical trials will require specifically designed primary endpoints and indications. However, if you are an investigator at an institution and you're working with a drug that is already approved or a device that is already approved for another indication, it's a little bit easier to explore different indications and applications. If you're a single investigator performing an investigator-initiated study, as compared to a drug or device company that's trying to explore different indications, that's a bit more regulated. But if you are just an investigator at an institution and you want to, test an already approved drug on another disease state, that would just be a matter of writing up a protocol, submitting it to your own institutional review board, and then going through your local approval process. But in general, like a drug or device company can't do a catch-all clinical trial. It's a little bit more tightly regulated according to the indication.
Okay. Yeah, I think you answered this one before, but with COVID vaccines, they were able to pipeline the 3 phases very closely together to expedite the timeline. Is this only possible in an emergency, or can a company like Neuralink throw extra money at the process to be able to pipeline the different phases?
So with device trials, like I mentioned, like you don't have phase 1, 2, and 3. You have your feasibility and pivotal studies. And it's not really possible to move into a pivotal study without that initial feasibility and safety data. And while like the FDA is kind of it can be like a pay to play situation, throwing money at the process, it's not going to speed things up dramatically. However, with the COVID vaccines, a lot of developers used adaptive design protocols where you're combining your phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 2 and phase 3. So with the breakthrough device designation, they do have an opportunity to work with the FDA for that adaptive protocol design. So with an adaptive protocol, like I mentioned, like you can combine your phase 1 and phase 2, or phase 2 and phase 3 to expedite the process. And then also you can kind of plan at the beginning for modifications to the protocol after an interim analysis. So, you can, change the dose mid-study after an interim analysis, or you can plan for, population enrichment, like enrolling kind of a subset of your patient population, like narrowing down the recruitment for a certain population that may benefit the most. You can shift towards dosing plans that seem to be a little bit more beneficial, or you can, include options to stop or, speed up your trial through adaptive design. So I think the COVID vaccine development benefited from adaptive design. And in addition, they also had, the efficacy of the COVID vaccines could be proven a lot quicker just because of the spread of COVID. Instead of waiting years, they were able to prove efficacy within a couple months. And they also enrolled the trials a lot quicker due to the, global pandemic. So I think it's tempting when you have a precedent like the development of COVID vaccines to think, why can't all drugs or devices be developed this way? And while there are aspects of vaccine development that can apply to other drugs and devices broadly, it was really a unique circumstance. However, there are a lot of therapies in which the phase 1 and 2 and phase 2 and 3 phases are combined. And you can do protocol modifications following your interim analysis to optimize and perhaps speed up the process.
What sets Neuralink's FDA clinical trials apart from other similar companies like BlackRock Neurotech?
I don't think I can answer that without seeing their proposed clinical trials. I think what may set them apart is, their exploratory endpoints. I think the primary endpoint for their initial trials is just going to be safety. So looking at treatment emergent adverse events, or, adverse events that, come up and appear to be related to the treatment, and just verifying that it is safe. So in that sense, I think their trials are going to be very similar. I think it'll boil down to, who are the investigators that they're working with, what is their inclusion criteria, what's the exact patient population that they're looking at. I anticipate the ages are going to be similar. Usually you're looking at, 18 to 70 years old for patients with the implanted BCIs. It really will just have to wait and see once their clinical trial registration posts.
Based on your knowledge, is this process similar on the medical device side? For
Yes.
The things that there can be parallels for?
Yeah. So in a medical device study, you're still going to have a database that's derived from the protocol, even though the phases of a medical device study are different from that of a drug therapy. You're still going to have your required regulatory filings. You're still going to have consents for subjects who are enrolled in the trial, and you're still going to need to verify the data. So I think operationally, device and drug trials are very similar, but from a regulatory standpoint, they are governed by different bodies.
I think when they initially got this breakthrough device designation, people thought that, hey, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because there's other devices that are similar to Neuralink that have been in existence for many years. And therefore, it's not actually a breakthrough device. But I found there's a statement that the FDA says, as long as there's potentially a significant positive impact on public health, then they could get this designation. And so, yeah, I guess I just wanted to verify that that's true.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are, comparable devices. There's no approved comparable device. I mean, I think there is one approved BCI, but it's not implantable. And of course, there are other implantable BCIs that have an active IDE and are actively enrolling subjects. However, I think that, it's totally reasonable that Neuralink would receive a breakthrough device designation.
Okay. Can you go through and describe like an IDE, PMA, and de novo just briefly?
Sure. So an IDE, or investigational device exemption, is basically an application to conduct a clinical trial with a device that is not currently approved. It's required for all class 3 devices, any other de novo device typically, or some class 1 or class 2 devices.
Okay.
A PMA is a pre-market application. So it's required for all class 3 devices or non-substantially equivalent class 1 or class 2 predicate devices. And substantially equivalent means that it does not qualify for, or excuse me, substantially equivalent means that it does qualify for what's called a 510K pre-market notification. So the substantial equivalence refers to an already marketed device or a device that was legally marketed prior to May 28th, 1976. So if it is substantially equivalent, then you don't have to go through the trial process, and you can apply for that pre-market notification or 510K rather than a full pre-market approval. There have been criticisms of this. In some cases, a company may, instead of innovating a design, they may just kind of make small improvements to the previous model. And if you kind of have these series of pre-market notifications with substantial equivalence, even though you're referring to the previous iteration of a device, for that substantial equivalent pre-market notification, you get 8 generations down the line, and it's not really a substantial equivalent to the originally cited device.
Gotcha. And then de novo.
Yes. So a de novo is a device that does not have a substantial equivalence. It may be entering the regulation process as a class 3 device. However, if it's considered low or moderate risk, then the sponsor can approve to have that de novo device designation. So although it doesn't have a substantial equivalent device, if it has low risk, it can be considered de novo and go through the pre-market notification 510K process rather than the full pre-market application process.
Okay. And then there's 3 classes of medical devices, class 1, class 2, class 3. Mm-hmm. Class 1 is the least invasive. Is that correct?
Yeah. So class 1 is something like a Band-Aid, a tongue depressor, gauze, very low risk. No trials are needed for these at about 75% of the time. And really the only regulation involved with them is device registration and then manufacturing and labeling regulations. So essentially, if you have a class 1 device, typically you're just registering the device with the FDA and paying the registration fee. Class 2 devices are, considered moderate risk. So they're things that don't sustain life, things like surgical systems, sutures, like electrodes. Usually no trials are needed for these. They can fall back on that pre-market notification a lot of the time. And just like the class 1 device, it's really just the registration, manufacturing, and labeling. They may require some trials, and typically like a class 2 device, it takes 6 months for approval. I did note that like the Da Vinci surgical system is considered a class 2 device. And I believe the approved BCI on the market is also a class 2 device.
I guess this kind of brings up the fact that like there are many different things that Neuralink could have to get approval for, right? Like the electrodes, yes, the robot, the link itself. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think if there are other things in addition to those 3.
Yeah, I think the surgical system and the Neuralink, the actual chip and electrodes. I think the implant itself would be one device, and then the surgical system would be separate. However, as I was researching for this, it's something that I couldn't really say with certainty if it would be, joint or separate. My hunch would be it'll be separate approval processes for their surgical system and the implant.
Folks at BrainGate have said that they want to help Neuralink to accelerate the progress as much as they can, just because there are other like medical and science benefits from working with them. So how often do you see like research groups and or companies working closely together?
I mean, it's hard to say. I guess my answer would be like quite frequently. I think in brain computer interface development, there is a pretty solid example of this with BlackRock Neurotech and ClearPoint Neuro, who are collaborating to, create the automated surgery solution. So BlackRock Neuro actually spun out of the University of Utah, and that's really common with biotechs to kind of spin out of research labs at universities. And there's a really strong collaboration between academic medical centers and drug and device companies. And anyway, so BlackRock spun out of University of Utah. ClearPoint Neuro has, an approved surgical stereotactic guidance systems for neurosurgery. So, you have that existing example of two neurodevelopment companies collaborating, BlackRock with the electrode arrays and their brain computer interface technology, and then ClearPoint Neuro with the automated surgical system. So I think to succeed, I think you do have to be willing to collaborate, whether that's with your research centers, laboratories, manufacturing facilities. I think you really cannot go it alone in drug and device development.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I guess like just coming at it from the perspective of, hey, here's this company that exists now, and they're collaborating with this research organization. It seems like, oh, well, there's always all these collaborations, but actually it's probably really organic. Like somebody who worked in that research organization or at the university is now like, oh, I'm going to continue the work that I was working on. Mm-hmm. And this company is like the one that's doing it. So I'm going to work with them. And then they like know everybody that they were working with in their research lab. So they end up just partnering.
Yeah. I mean, and I think working with a company that already has an approved device that could be used as a predicate device, like ClearPoint, that it gives you a huge advantage in the regulatory process.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I guess that was a question that I was going to save for later, but
oh, I'm sorry.
No. Yeah. No, yeah. Definitely. I was going to ask about this. So recently there's been news that Elon was talking to somebody at another company called Synchron, mm-hmm. About rumors that they were going to merge together or collaborate in some way. I kind of felt like things didn't really add up quite right. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the speculation was that, oh, if this is true, the reason that they would do it is to accelerate the FDA regulatory process.
Yeah. So Synchron has an active IDE. They have an ongoing clinical trial looking at, patients with severe quadriparesis, excuse me. So I think that would be very advantageous. However, I think the Synchron technology is, it's the actual BCI. And I think something that's really interesting about Neuralink is their kind of, multi-patent approach. So the use of the surgical robot, the actual, algorithmic decoding, and then of course, like the electrode and arrays. So I think that's it. It's going to prove a challenge to get all of the technology through the regulatory and development process. I think a more targeted approach is typically quicker.
4 phases of clinical trials. One is the first phase. Let's get a sense of like timeline. First phase is like 3 months and entails 10 participants is what I found.
Yeah. So, before your phase 1, you have your preclinical development. So you have animal and cell trials. You also can do data modeling that can assist in expediting your application process. And then you have your phase 1 trial, which basically asks, like, is this safe? And I guess I should say that for drug development, you have your preclinical phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then for device trials, it's a little different. Like, of course, you also have preclinical, but then for device trials, it's your pilot or feasibility studies, and then your pivotal studies. So for drug trials, phase 1 asks, is this drug safe? And so you're typically enrolling 20 to 100 either healthy volunteers or patients, depending on the indication. If you're looking at, say, like a psoriasis, type 2 diabetes, other drugs, you may ask healthy volunteers to test for the pharmacokinetics, establishing the dose, and then just seeing if it's safe to test in humans. So about 70% of drugs that go through phase 1 trials will move on to phase 2. And like you mentioned, the phase 1 trials, they really only last a couple months. A patient may come in for, a couple weeks in a row just to establish, will this hurt someone? Phase 2 trials assess safety and efficacy in the patient population. So this is really looking at basic efficacy. So you're going to have a much more targeted patient population, and you're also looking at a little bit longer studies. So typically, depending on the indication, you're looking at 6 months to a year, and just depending on the indication, again, you're looking at either hundreds or sometimes up to like 1,000 patients in a phase 2 trial. So after phase 2, approximately 30% of drugs move from phase 2 to phase 3. And in phase 3, that's your pivotal study. So that demonstrates the effectiveness of a drug. So efficacy is like, does the drug influence a particular outcome in a particular patient population? And effectiveness is, does this drug work to treat this disease broadly? So effectiveness, you're going to be assessing in a more kind of real world situation. So efficacy may be, does a particular lab value improve, or does tumor size shrink, or does this specific quality of life outcome assessment like have any effects? Where an effectiveness will be, does the patient live? It's kind of broader, and like phase 3. We're again looking at like 25% move on from phase 3, and that's even generous.
25% of the original, or
25% of subjects, or not subject, 25% of drugs that are in phase 3 will move on. So it gets, I believe if you look at like 12% of drugs that enter the drug development pathway are going to be approved by the FDA. And even that metric, I think, is generous.
Gotcha.
So drug development broadly will take longer, usually, like they say, 12 years from from the lab to approval, where device usually takes anywhere from, like they say, 3 to 7 years.
I see. Okay. And there's, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And then device development, like I mentioned, you have your pilot or feasibility study where you're looking at a lower number of patients, usually like in the tens, less than 100 usually, which basically you're trying to establish is this safe for your primary endpoint. Your secondary or exploratory endpoints may assess, usability, or, your primary functional goal for the device. And then after a feasibility study, you'll move on to your pivotal study, which, is a larger study to, determine the efficacy or effectiveness, and then also to further assess the adverse events.
Cool. And then I think that there's this like timeline for drugs after they get completely approved and the company starts working on manufacturing the drug. They have like 17 years, right, for the patent to expire. Mm-hmm. For device, there's no, like it's just the normal patent life.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with, the drug life cycle from approval to expiration of patent, but I do know after a drug is approved, you have your post-market surveillance, which, is also considered a phase 4 trial. And for therapies, gene therapies, there is a 10 market, or excuse me, for gene therapy, there is a 10-year phase 4 study that's required for additional safety monitoring.
I see. And that's like pretty consistent interaction with the FDA. Like somebody from the FDA comes on site and make sure the processes are like they're, I don't even know, like for gene therapy, are they manufacturing something? So they have to go to the office and check manufacturing.
Yeah. So with the gene therapy, usually you're dosed with the gene therapy. So, it depends on the exact therapy type, but for personalized gene therapy, where you're getting, apheresis, you're getting your cells taken out, sent to a lab, you're getting you're getting your cells transfected, and then they return it from the lab, put it back inside of you, and then you're in the initial trial, so like a phase 2, phase 3 trial, and then after the termination of that trial, you've completed all the study visits, you're enrolled into another trial where you're returning to the site, usually on like a 6-month yearly basis, and they'll follow you for 10 years. And, it's run just like a phase 2, phase 3 trial, where you have your trial data points. They're doing a statistical analysis of the data, whereas like a post-market surveillance, that they're really just looking for adverse events, which are just reported to the FDA a little bit more informally.
FDA breakthrough device designation. Neuralink getting that designation doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to go substantially faster. It's more of just getting more access to resources, and therefore it may go a little bit faster, but it's not going to be like way faster than not having that designation.
Yeah, correct. It doesn't really speed up. It's not like an emergency use or like a public health emergency type of designation. It really just gives you increased collaboration and access to the FDA prior to your various submissions, whether that's your IDE submission,
PMA.
Yeah, PMA, sorry. So
Okay.
yeah, it gives you increased access either prior to your IDE or your PMA submission. If you're going to go that route, there is a chance that, it could go de novo. But, you kind of wait and see after the IDE. And I'm my site's main point of contact, and I travel for my job primarily to make sure that the data that the sites are entering into the trial database matches the subject source documents or their medical records, making sure that the trials being conducted according to good clinical practice and the regulatory filings are up to date. And then, of course, the primary concern is safety, and making sure that safety events for subjects are being appropriately reported to the FDA. We primarily focus on drug development. However, we do work with some device manufacturers and device trials. In addition to source data verification, I'm also looking for any protocol deviations. So any procedure that's not done according to protocol needs to be documented and reported to an institution's institutional review board, which is basically the governing body, the regulating body for research at a hospital. So I identify protocol deviations. If they're considered to be major or critical, there's a special, reporting process for those. And then I'm also looking at their regulatory filings. So there's a whole gamut of essential regulatory documents that we're expected to see on site.